The Exorcist traumatized me when I was a kid. I watched it way before I probably should have due to having a mom that loved horror and lacked boundaries. A lifetime later, The Exorcist is a movie I have obsessed over, watched 100 times, and never stopped thinking about. I will never watch the new Exorcist Believer again. It failed to capture even one fraction of the spirit of the original. Believer is a competently made film, well shot, well acted, no fault there. The issue is in the writing. And since this is a channel about writing, it's worth exploring why The Exorcist holds up as a horror masterpiece while Believer is just laughable. I mean, all the Exorcist staples are there. Documentary style, the creepy little girls, nastiness, religion, grotesque violence. But it is not hard to argue The Exorcist Believer is not only not a sequel to The Exorcist, it's not even in the same universe. It may as well be a sequel to Repossessed.
God created man in his own image.
Then how do you explain Pee Wee Herman?
Repossessed.
Why is the original so powerful and yet Believer so awful? From now on, we'll refer to Exorcist Believer as simply Belieber, just so there's no confusion. First, let's look at the writers. At one hand, we have William Peter Blatty, and the other, David Gordon Green and Peter Sattler. Let's focus on David Gordon Green, just to be clear. Both started out as comedy writers, oddly enough. William Peter Blatty never intended to write horror. He wrote a series of comedy screenplays, including A Shot in the Dark for Blake Edwards. It was only after reading a story about a young man who survived an exorcism that Blatty came up with the idea for The Exorcist, pushing him into the horror genre, where he would stay for the rest of his life. David Gordon Green started out in the indie film world and graduated to making stoner comedies like Your Highness or Pineapple Express. He's an odd choice to take over a horror franchise, but horror has a weird connection with comedy. Jordan Peele came from comedy. Zach Cregger, the director of last year's Barbarian, came from comedy. Horror and comedy are distant cousins. Both rely on breaking taboos. They are genres for creators who like to cross boundaries. But Blatty has an ear for realistic dialogue and populates his film with complex characters. And David Gordon Green made this.
Yes, sir. Look at Courtney's new haircut. Doesn't it make his head look like the tip of a penis?
Of course, that isn't fair. It's a cheap shot. David Gordon Green began making Sundance fodder like George Washington, which is great, and I'm a sucker for Pineapple Express. And I even like his first Halloween movie. The others we will not discuss. But if he is capable of creating subtle, nuanced characters, he isn't doing that here. Which brings us to our hero. The protagonist of Believer is a single father, Victor Fielding, whose daughter disappears for 3 days and comes back possessed by the devil. There's nothing wrong with the performance here. He is fine in the role, but the writers make a few mistakes that make him far less suitable than the original's Chris McNeil. He's given a flaw he must overcome. This is common to how most movies operate. A character has a flaw which defines them and which will define the journey they go on. They go on the journey to undo this flaw. He is a father who lost his wife during the birth of their daughter. He had to choose to let one of them live and now lives with the guilt of having made that choice. His flaw is he cannot bear to face the memory of his wife, and so he keeps his daughter away from her memory. But Ellen Burstyn's Chris McNeil in the original has no real flaw or sin to pay for. This is what is so horrible about The Exorcist. The story happened to her just because it did. Bad things will happen to you no matter what you do or who you are. There's something powerful about leaving the mother to have such little character arc. This just happened to her because it can happen to anyone. For any reason, it could happen to you. Even her atheism is not treated as a flaw. It is just who she is. You would think that William Peter Blatty's devout Catholicism would cause him to evangelize to poor Chris McNeil, but he refrains. Maybe her faith has changed by the end of the film? But if it has, we don't know it. Blatty also makes Chris McNeil a rich and powerful actress, a movie star. This brings the terror home in a more devastating way. Even with every resource at your disposal, the devil can come for you and take everything. Now, where Victor Fielding is not a terrible protagonist, and is certainly not the reason why this movie is such a failure, there are secondary protagonists in The Believer, the family of the other little girl. but they are denied any major role or depth. The movie seems afraid to portray them with anything other than suspicion and contempt. They are treated like religious weirdos that probably caused their daughter to fall into the devil's arms. They didn't need to be the equal to Victor Fielding, but they could have been given more screen time. Look at a movie like Prisoners. In this film, similarly to The Exorcist Believer, 2 little girls are taken, and the families are left to deal with the horror of this. It gives Hugh Jackman's main character the majority of screen time, but still allows for the other family to have an impact on the story. But Belieber seems unwilling to portray these people with compassion. Contrast The Exorcist, told from the perspective of a devout Catholic. The atheist mother of Reagan is treated with far more respect and nuance. The movie Belieber seems to be afraid of religion as a topic, and I'm not particularly religious either, so understand this criticism does not come from a desire to evangelize. My criticism comes from a place of simply what makes good story. A storyteller needs to accept the world their characters reside in and play by the rules. You can't have The Exorcist without Catholicism. If you want to make that movie, call it something else. And you can't have The Exorcism without The Exorcist. But yet, they try. In the original, the film begins with this exorcist, Max von Sydow, a man who is tangled with the devil and now must confront him once more. But the exorcist of the title is really Father Damien Karras. This is who the story is about, and this is who gets that story arc that's missing from Chris McNeil. Karras is a man having a crisis of faith. Karras' character arc is that he begins doubting his faith and ends sacrificing himself to save Reagan. Karras is well developed throughout the story. He is a complex man, a boxer and a scholar. We see his relationship with another priest and also with the detective. This is his story as much as it is Ellen Burstyn's. The many exorcists in Belieber, however, are non-existent characters. We don't know anything about them. Even the ever-reliable Ann Dowd is terrible in this movie. Her character is reduced to a 1-paragraph backstory. She was pregnant once and got rid of her child. Okay. Instead of a Catholic priest, Belieber brings in a sort of Unitarian Universalist coalition of celebrants. It is unwilling to allow for the possibility of a heroic Catholic, which could maybe be an interesting idea. This idea of having all of the exorcists from around the world and a sort of weird superhero team of exorcists, but they don't develop any of these people. A small arc is given to the one Catholic priest allowed screen time. He shows up in 3 scenes. When the church finally denies him the right to perform the exorcism, he refuses to participate. He refuses to go against his masters. He puts the Bible in the hand of someone else and tells her she can do it herself. You can do it! Then, of course, in the last moment, he shows up to help. And 2 minutes later, he's dead. We're never even introduced to him. He has no backstory or development. I don't think we even see him talk to the girls. We don't care about him, and his death is meaningless. I guess we don't need him if the exorcism in this version is just simple enough to pass off to anyone. All you have to do is read the words. And there is the other problem, the exorcism itself. The original Exorcist establishes the rules of exorcism, creating a new subgenre and changing horror films forever. It's actually such a powerful experience that a rise in actual exorcisms occurred over the next few years in a bizarre case of social contagion. But the original film establishes the rules of exorcism as we know it. First, the exorcist must make the demon uncomfortable to push them out of the host's body. They might use prayer or holy water, or press their crucifix against the head of the host, or place their stole around the host's neck. If the exorcist can get the demon to tell him its name, the exorcist gains power over the demon. Then the exorcist must read the rites, and they must have faith, and they must read with conviction. The demon's goal is corruption. It does not kill the host outright. That would be easy to do, but that is not its goal. It doesn't want the body, it wants the soul. It wants to corrupt a pure soul and terrorize those who love the host. But in Belieber, the goal of the demon seems to be to cause physical harm. It can break necks with a thought. Then why it doesn't just kill everyone in the room no longer makes sense. Wouldn't it be easier? Why, as a demon, deal with the pain of the exorcism when you can just snap everyone's neck with a thought? Sure, the original, Regan breaks the neck of Chris McNeil's director friend, but the demon does this off-screen when no one is looking. It is part of the agenda of the demon to terrorize those who love Regan, to make us wonder, did she do it? The demon knows that the detective would never be able to convict a little girl for throwing a grown man out a window. Its rules are consistent. The Exorcist sets the rules and plays by them. It is consistent and believable. But the rules of Belieber are never consistent. The method of exorcism? Just read the words. Anybody can do it. The exorcism operates under no internal logic, no method. Anything can happen at any time. At any moment, the monster might be driven out by a prayer said by your neighbor, or it might never leave, or it might kill everyone in the room. Depends on what it feels like at the time. And this is why it's not scary. Stephen King talks about 3 types of horror. The first and most significant is terror. Terror is the feeling of dread that permeates the story. It's the hardest to do and therefore the most powerful. The second is horror, which would be the simple tricks, jump scares, and the like. And the last is revulsion, the gross out. King says he first tries for terror, and when he can't get it, he settles for horror, and then he goes for the gross out. He's not above anything. The original Exorcist is all terror. It never attempts a jump scare. The horror is based on what is behind the closed door, knowing there is a little girl upstairs who is sick and filled with a malevolent force, and there is nothing you can do about it. The scariest parts of The Exorcist 1973 are the quiet moments, wondering when the next horrible thing will happen. The dread is created through the slow burn of allowing Regan to get sicker and sicker as the story progresses. It starts simply. She wanders downstairs during a party, pisses on the floor, and says to the astronaut, "You're gonna die up there." This moment is so disturbing because it is believable. Something a mentally ill little girl might do in real life. To anyone who is a parent, this will hit home as a familiar feeling. The first moment when your child reveals they are sick, usually something simple like maybe a night of vomiting, and sometimes for some parents it's far worse. But the pain of watching your child get sick, knowing you can't do anything about it, is brutal and real, and the definition of what terror is all about. When Regan is put through a series of medical exams, the camera lingers like a documentary film crew, watching the child tortured as the doctors desperately try to save her, but find nothing physically wrong with her. It's sure, in the end, the original goes for the jugular, going for the horror and the revulsion, with brutal violence and split lips and blistered skin, but it gets there so slowly. We watch Regan's skin get worse in every scene. We watch her get paler and greener. We watch Regan slowly disappear and be replaced by Pazuzu. In Belieber, there is one effective sequence where the girls disappear for a few days. The filmmakers wisely play upon every parent's worst nightmare. What if your child just didn't come home one day? It works because it is real. This is terror. When the girls come back home, they begin acting strange, and it's one of the few effective sequences of the movie, but the filmmakers show no patience here. 3 scenes later, and the girls are headbutting people, cutting off their toenails, and jumping at the camera, and they look like this. There's no slow build, no time to get to know them as girls or watch them behave in odd ways that disturb. By 40 minutes into the movie, they are full-on monsters. And then all the movie has left to do is this. The girls are so violent that the reality of the film is broken, and we cannot put it back together. There is no reality in which a young girl stabs the eyes out of a septuagenarian where she would be allowed to walk free. She would be put in an institution immediately. This is what the demon in Exorcist 1973 understands. It walks the line. Regan kills one man and does it off-screen, and then she is investigated by the police. The demon knows that if it kills, it must kill off-screen when no one is looking because it does not want Regan put away in an institution. If it does, then it can't fulfill its real purpose, to terrorize the people around Regan, to break the priest's spirit. If all it wants is to kill, it can do that any time. It is the insidiousness of this plan that makes the demon Pazuzu one of the most horrifying movie monsters of all time. It's not simple like a zombie or a werewolf. It doesn't want to kill you. It wants you to burn in hell for eternity and take everyone you love's psyche with it. The Exorcist is a masterpiece created by two men who believed in what they were making, who wanted to put the audience through hell. Belieber is a cynical cash grab, dependent on our memories of that movie we saw that scared us once, rather than trying to make anything new. It suffers the problems so many movies today suffer from. It is a work for hire and therefore uninspired. It is not courageous enough to take the idea and do something new with it, like the Evil Dead franchise did with the recent Evil Dead Rise. It requires you to want to see the same thing again, but it can't give that to you either, not with the conviction of a true believer. And this is what separates Blatty from Green, is that William Peter Blatty is a true believer. A devout Catholic, his films explore themes of faith. Blatty has expressed that the purpose of The Exorcist is to show that evil exists, and if evil exists, then so must God. And this is not a Christian rock band making music just for the devoted. This is a real Catholic artist exploring ideas of faith in a challenging way. Watch his amazing film, The Ninth Configuration, for a continuation on the themes of faith. His characters are all struggling with faith, but Blatty is a nuanced writer. He makes the point to make his protagonist a non-believer. Chris McNeil is an atheist. She doesn't believe in any of this crap. And he doesn't try to convert her either. The devil comes for believers and non-believers alike. But Gordon Green denies the Catholicism of the story. And look, again, I'm not particularly religious, so my point of arguing for the need for the faith to be present here is more for a storytelling purpose than it is any argument for the need for religion on film. When the movie gets rid of the Catholicism of the hero, it feels inauthentic. And what is the purpose of this story? What does the writer believe? The original was an authentic exploration of a priest doubting his faith. There was a point of view here. But in Belieber, not only does there seem to be no real idea expressed by the writer, it goes out of its way through clumsy monologuing and cardboard characters to express the opposite idea of the original. It argues that you don't need faith to defeat the devil. In fact, it is not very helpful. The other girl's father is an evangelical Christian, a man of faith, and the hero is a non-believer. It is the believer father that makes the decision to doom his daughter. The film goes out of its way to portray its religious characters as either completely ineffective and weak, like our Exorcist with his head twisted off, or in the case of the girl's father, corrupt. The Exorcist Believer here commits its most atrocious sin. It refutes the belief system of the first movie. William Peter Blatty would have hated this movie. And while there's a line in which the author of a story no longer owns his story and it becomes part of the overall culture, sure, but when a work goes out of its way to go against its author, it can no longer really be considered connected to the original story or in the same universe. It would be the equivalent of Star Wars arguing against the Force, arguing that our intuition is wrong and we should use a trusty targeting computer whenever possible. Exorcist Believer is ironically titled as it believes in nothing. And that's its problem.
Please like and subscribe, or your mother sucks in hell.